were 7 years old or 8 or 9, someone was talking about a child born blind, or born with something wrong from the very beginning, born into poverty, born into a country at war, born into circumstances that no prayer or effort would easily change. And you ask the question children always ask, why? Why did God allow this? Why was this child born this way? Why would a loving God assign this suffering to someone who had done nothing? The answer you received was soft and circular. God's plan. A mystery beyond our understanding. We'll know one day in heaven. It landed in your chest like something hollow. Not because you were faithless, because you sensed the answer was missing something. Something structural, something that should be there, that would make it make sense. You were right. There is a missing piece, and it has been sitting in your Bible since 553 AD. John chapter 9, verse 2. The disciples of Jesus ask him about a man born blind since birth. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Stop there. Read that question again. They are asking whether the man sinned before he was born. Not a theological mistake. Not a confused question from uneducated fishermen. A question from inside a world where souls exist before bodies. A world where the conditions of birth can reflect something prior to birth. A world where the why of suffering had an answer that did not require mystery. Jesus engages the question on its own terms. He does not say, "That makes no sense." He does not say, "You cannot sin before you exist." He answers directly, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned." He corrects the attribution. He does not correct the cosmology. The doctrine that would have completed your answer was voted away in 553 AD by an emperor. The question in John 9 is still in your Bible, exactly as it was written. The answer was removed, the question stayed. I took New Testament Greek in my first year of seminary. I was 31, still teaching high school history, taking night classes, thinking I would end up with a theology degree and keep doing what I was doing, just with more tools, which is more or less what happened. Not in the way I planned. The professor was working through John chapter 9, the healing of the man born blind. We spent a full session on the mud, the pool of Siloam, the Pharisees' interrogation afterward, the theological weight of Jesus claiming to be the light of the world, the mounting conflict with religious authorities. Good class. Dense. The kind that made me feel like I was finally getting the real thing. I was following along in my Greek text when I got to verse 2. The disciples' question. I stopped. I wrote in the margin. I still have that text. It is on the shelf behind me. I wrote, "How could he sin before he was born?" I waited for the professor to address it. He moved on to verse 3. I raised my hand. He said it was a common misunderstanding. The disciples were probably suggesting the man's sin after birth could have caused a condition present from birth, or that it was a kind of theological hypothetical. Scholars had various readings. We should focus on Jesus's answer, not the question. After class, I went back to the Greek. The verb is the aorist tense, past action, completed action. Who sinned? Not who will sin, not who might hypothetically sin. Who sinned? And the man was born blind. So if he sinned before he was born. The grammar is not ambiguous. The question assumes that a soul existed before a body. I went to the library. I was looking for anyone who had addressed this seriously. I found Origen. And when I found Origen, everything I thought I knew about what early Christianity believed stopped being reliable. Let me be precise about this, because the precision matters. John 9, verse 2. The disciples ask Jesus, "Rabbi, Who sinned? This man or his parents? That he was born blind? This question is theologically incoherent inside a single life framework. Inside the framework the Church has taught since the 6th century, one soul created at conception, one life, one death, one judgment. This question makes no sense. If the man was born blind, he could not have sinned after birth to cause blindness at birth. The only reading that makes the question coherent is one where the soul existed before the body, where a soul could carry something, some history, some prior cause, that shaped the conditions of its birth. Jesus does not correct the premise. He says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. He is correcting the causal attribution. He is not saying, that question is based on a false assumption. He answers within the pre-existence framework as a live, coherent theological category. Because in the year 30, in Second Temple Judaism, it was. N.T. Wright, the New Testament scholar, acknowledges the oddness of the disciples' question. Raymond E. Brown, in his Anchor Bible commentary on John, one of the most rigorous academic treatments of this gospel in existence, notes that the question implies awareness of Jewish traditions about prenatal sin and soul pre-existence. Neither of them ultimately endorses the pre-existence reading, but both acknowledge that the question is strange, and that the strange thing about it is exactly what I am describing. There is also a passage in the Talmud, Tractat Nida 30b, where Rabbi Simle teaches that the embryo's soul knows Torah before birth and forgets it at the moment it enters the world. Not a fringe tradition, a rabbinic teaching preserved in the Talmud, the soul that exists before the body. This was Second Temple Jewish cosmology. The disciples of Jesus were raised in it. Their question in John 9 is evidence of that cosmology, not a mistake. And the evidence is still there. Right there in chapter 9. The doctrine that makes the question fully coherent was voted away in 553 AD. The question stayed. You have one life. You did not choose where you were born. You did not choose to be born into a body with limitations, or into poverty, or into a family that carried wounds that would become yours before you could understand what was happening. You did not choose your circumstances at birth any more than the man born blind chose his. And yet, within this single life, which you did not design, in conditions you did not select, an eternal verdict will be rendered. This life, this one combination of circumstance and choice, and suffering and recovery, one verdict, forever. That is the framework. It has been the framework since 553 AD, when an emperor decided it was the only acceptable one. The disciples in John 9 were asking a question that implied a different framework entirely, one where the conditions of birth were not arbitrary, not a divine mystery too deep to understand, not simply God's plan, one where there was a prior context that made the why answerable, one where a soul arrived at birth carrying something that extended further back than birth. You were raised on the framework that voted that question away. But the question is still in your Bible. It has been sitting there since John wrote it down, pointing at an answer that was removed. John 9 is not the only place in the Gospels where this cosmology surfaces. It may not even be the most direct. Matthew chapter 11 verse 14. Jesus is speaking to crowds about John the Baptist. He has been describing John's role, his importance, his place in the prophetic tradition. And then he says, and if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. He is the Elijah who was to come. Not, he fulfills the spirit of Elijah. Not, he is a prophet in the tradition of Elijah. He is Elijah. Elijah had lived and died roughly 900 years before John the Baptist, the prophet who called down fire on Mount Carmel, who confronted King Ahab, who was taken up in a whirlwind, according to 2 Kings That Elijah. 9 centuries earlier, Jesus says he has come back. He is here in the person of John. Then he returns to this in Matthew 17, verses 12 and 13. The disciples have just come down from the Transfiguration, where Moses and Elijah appeared. They asked Jesus why the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come before the end. Jesus answers, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. And the text tells us immediately, then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. They understood immediately. No confusion, no theological debate among themselves. Elijah had come back. In John, the disciples got it at once. The Church's standard reading of these verses is what is called spiritual fulfillment. John did not literally come back as Elijah. He came in the spirit and power of Elijah. The basis for this reading is Luke chapter 1, verse 17, where the angel Gabriel tells Zechariah that John will go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. But here is the problem. Matthew 11, verse 14 does not contain the phrase, in the spirit and power. That qualifier is Luke's editorial interpretation. Matthew records Jesus' words without it. He is the Elijah who was to come. No qualifier, no softening, no like Elijah or in the manner of Elijah. Bart Ehrman, the New Testament scholar at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who has spent decades documenting early Christian diversity, notes in Lost Christianities that Jesus operated within a Jewish world far more cosmologically varied than the later church acknowledged. The spiritual fulfillment reading is not wrong because it is impossible. It is strained because Matthew does not ask for it. The reincarnation reading is not the complicated one. It is the literal one. The church has spent 1,500 years explaining why Jesus' own words in Matthew do not mean what they say. Here is where I need to give you context. Without it, John 9 and Matthew 11 sound like cherry-picked anomalies. They are not anomalies. By the time Jesus was born, the Jewish world had been in sustained contact with Greek philosophy for over 3 centuries. Alexander the Great's conquests in the 4th century BCE brought Platonic and Pythagorean thought into direct, ongoing conversation with Hebrew theology. The result was not uniformity, it was diversity. Significant, documented, irreducible diversity. The Essenes at Qumran, whose library we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls, held positions on the soul closer to Platonic pre-existence than to the later Christian single-life framework. They believed the soul descended from a place of purity into a material body and would return there. This is not speculation. It is in their texts. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing in the 1st century CE, a contemporary of the early church, describes the Pharisees' beliefs about the soul and writes that they hold to what he calls a revolution of the soul. Good souls pass into other bodies. The Pharisees, the mainstream religious party of Jesus' era. Jewish Alexandrian philosophy, represented by figures like Philo of Alexandria, who was alive during Jesus' lifetime, was deeply saturated with Platonic ideas about pre-existing souls. Not a fringe movement, the intellectual mainstream of Hellenized Judaism. What this means is simple. The disciples who asked Jesus about prenatal sin in John 9 were not confused. They were not making a theological error. They were speaking from inside a cosmological world that accepted the pre-existence of souls as a live theological option. The same world Jesus was raised in, the same tradition that shaped the questions people brought to him. Jesus did not correct them, because in the Jewish world of 30 CE, the question made sense. An emperor 3 centuries later decided it should not. You are a Jew in Alexandria in the 1st century before the Common Era. Your grandfather read Plato. Your rabbi quotes Aristotle alongside Torah. The world you inhabit is one where Moses and Socrates are not opposites. They are part of the same ongoing conversation about the nature of the soul, the purpose of existence, and what justice looks like across a life. You believe the soul existed before the body. You believe material existence is a stage, not the only mode of being. You believe the circumstances of birth carry meaning that extends further back than birth. This is not exotic to you. It is theology. It is the air you breathe. 3 centuries later, Jesus is born into the descendant tradition of this world. His disciples carry these questions. They ask him about a man born blind and whether he sinned before he was born. He does not laugh. He does not correct the premise. He answers within it. Now move forward to 553 AD. Emperor Justinian I rules the Eastern Roman Empire from Constantinople. He has reconquered North Africa. He has taken back Italy from the Ostrogoths. He is building the largest Christian empire in history. And he has decided that the cosmological diversity that produced the disciples' question in John 9 is incompatible with the kind of Christianity he needs. 3 centuries of theological richness, compressed by a military emperor who needed one answer. Before the emperor acted, the tradition he suppressed had a name and a face. That name was Origen of Alexandria. Origen was born around 185 CE. He died around 253 CE. In the first 3 centuries of Christianity, he was considered, without significant dispute, the greatest Christian theologian alive. Not a peripheral figure, not a fringe thinker, the most prolific, most cited, most influential Christian scholar of the period before the Council of Nicaea. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate, the translation that remained the Western Church's standard for over 1,000 years, drew heavily from Origen. Ambrose of Milan, who baptized Augustine, was deeply shaped by Origen's framework. Gregory of Nyssa, one of the Cappadocian Fathers foundational to Trinitarian theology, worked within the tradition Origen had established. These are not obscure names. These are the architects of what became Orthodox Christianity. They all stood on Origen's shoulders. Origen's most important work was the De Principiis, periarchon in Greek, meaning on first principles. Written around 220 to 230 CE, it is the first systematic Christian theology ever composed. The first attempt to lay out a coherent, structured account of Christian doctrine from the ground up, and it teaches the pre-existence of souls, not as a side note, as a central structuring principle. Origen taught that all rational beings, he called them logikoi, existed as pure intelligences before the material world. The fall, in Origen's account, was not a single act in a garden. It was a movement, a cooling, a descent, a turning of divine fire away from its source. The Greek word for soul, psyche, may derive from the word for cold, psychros. Origen thought so. The soul is a cooling of what was once pure heat. Material existence is a consequence and a stage, not the final word. And crucially, souls would eventually return to God, through a process that might involve multiple modes of existence, through what Origen called the apokatastasis, universal restoration. Every soul, eventually, back to God. He was not condemned during his lifetime. He died peacefully around 253 CE after a life of extraordinary intellectual output. His students shaped the church. His framework produced the thinkers who built the tradition. And then, 300 years after his death, an emperor decided he was a heretic, not because new evidence had emerged, not because a council of theologians had debated the question freshly and arrived at a different conclusion, because the emperor needed a different kind of Christianity. Origen was condemned in 543 CE by a man who was not a bishop, not a theologian, not a pope, a military commander and a politician. 300 years after Origen was already dead. The room in Constantinople in 543 CE. The scholars gathered there are not debating theology in good faith. They are executing a brief. The emperor has decided what the answer is. Their job is to write the document. They write, "If anyone asserts the fabulous pre-existence of souls, and shall assert the monstrous restoration which follows from it, let him be anathema." Fabulous, as in mythological, invented, worthy of contempt. That is what they call the doctrine that produced the disciples' question in John 9. That is what they call the tradition Origen systematized and Jerome and Ambrose and Gregory of Nyssa built upon. Monstrous. That is what they call the apokatastasis, the eventual return of all souls to God. A God who restores everyone eventually. A God whose patience outlasts any soul's resistance. They call that monstrous. And you might ask, why? Why would an emperor need to eliminate a framework of cosmic justice and universal restoration? Because a Christianity of fear is more governable than a Christianity of hope. If all souls eventually return to God, regardless of the life they live, the threat of eternal damnation loses its edge. If the conditions of birth reflect prior context rather than divine mystery, the emperor's authority to impose suffering, war, poverty, conquest, cannot claim divine sanction. The framework of one life, followed by a judgment that cannot be appealed, followed by an eternal verdict that includes hell. That framework produces a population that obeys. The scholars in Constantinople did not write this down. They did not need to. The emperor understood it. They understood it. They wrote the anathema. They called it theology. Here's what they never told you about the council that made this official. Justinian issued his anathemas against Origen's teaching in 543 CE. 10 anathemas issued under his imperial authority alone. No council convened. No broad theological debate. An emperor's decree. The first anathema. If anyone asserts the fabulous pre-existence of souls, and shall assert the monstrous restoration which follows from it, let him be anathema. 10 years later, in 553 CE, what became known as the Second Council of Constantinople convened. The Fifth Ecumenical Council, one of the great defining councils of Christian doctrine. At that council, 15 additional anathemas against Origen's teachings were circulated for ratification. Modern scholarship, including the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, has confirmed that these 15 anathemas were not originated by the council itself. They were drafted by Justinian's court and submitted to the bishops for ratification. The bishops signed what the emperor's scholars wrote. But here is the detail that I could not get past when I first read this history. Pope Vigilius was the Bishop of Rome at the time, nominally the head of Western Christianity. He had been navigating Justinian's theological demands for years, and he was refusing to go along with the direction the council was taking. In 547 CE, 6 years before the council, Justinian's agents forcibly removed Vigilius from Rome and brought him to Constantinople. He was kept there for 8 years, not as a guest, under conditions approaching house arrest. When the council convened in 553 CE, Vigilius initially refused to attend. He issued a formal legal document, a constitutum, against the council's proceedings. He was then isolated further. Threatened, pressured by the imperial apparatus, he eventually capitulated. He issued a second constitutum endorsing the council's positions. He was permitted to leave Constantinople shortly before his death in 555 CE. The head of Western Christianity signed the condemnation of pre-existence of souls. As a political prisoner, the doctrine that reincarnation was never part of Christianity, that the Church had always universally, from the very beginning, rejected the pre-existence of souls, was established by a document. That document was signed by a pope, who signed it under duress, while detained by the emperor whose court had written it. Benitez spent 40 years asking a version of the same question I wrote in my margin. Not always in those words, not always about John 9 specifically, but the underlying question was always the same. At what point did Jesus' living, questioning, cosmologically rich tradition get compressed into an institution of fear? He identified 3 moments: the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, where the vote on Christology settled by majority what Jesus was; Gregory I's defamation of Mary Magdalene in 591 CE, which erased a central witness and enforcer of a different inheritance; and the condemnation of Origen in 553 CE. He called what happened in 553 the compression, the systematic narrowing of a tradition that had been spacious, that had room for Origen's evolving souls, for multiple modes of existence, for eventual universal restoration, for the disciples' question in John 9. Into a single corridor with no exits. Before the vote, the question of why people suffer from birth had a framework that implied cosmic justice. The conditions of birth reflected something prior to birth. Suffering was not arbitrary. It was not inexplicable. It was not simply God's plan beyond human understanding. It was part of a larger process, bending eventually toward restoration. After the vote, the answer became, God chose this for you, for reasons you cannot know, and your eternal fate will be decided by how you spend this single life that you did not design. Benitez's argument was not simply that the Church was wrong. His argument was that the transition from Origen's framework to the single-life judgment framework was a political choice, a choice that served the institution, that produced a population living under permanent existential threat, that turned the cosmological richness of the tradition Jesus inhabited into a machine for maintaining obedience. He did not use the word reincarnation often. He preferred pre-existence of souls, because reincarnation suggests a cycle. What Origen described was more like an arc, a long arc, bending toward God, through whatever modes of existence a soul needed to complete the journey. The Emperor called that monstrous restoration. Benitez called it the most important thing the Church erased. I think Benitez was right. At the end of that seminary semester, I went back to my Greek New Testament. I opened it to John chapter 9. I read verse 2 again. Rabbi, who sinned? This man or his parents? That he was born blind? I took out my notebook, the separate one I kept for questions I could not resolve, and I wrote. The question in verse 2 assumes an answer the council voted away in 553 AD. The disciples asked Jesus whether a man sinned before he was born. Jesus answered on the premise's own terms. The doctrine that makes the question coherent was removed by an emperor. The question is still here. The answer was removed. The question stayed. I put the pen down. I looked at that for a long time. If you ever sat with the question of why God allows children to be born blind, or born into war, or born into suffering they did nothing to deserve, and the answer you received felt thin and wrong to you, your instinct was not a failure of faith. You were sensing a gap. The gap is real. There was an answer in the tradition. It was in the question the disciples asked Jesus. It was in Jesus's literal statement about John the Baptist. It was in the theology of the most influential Christian thinker of the first 3 centuries. An emperor removed it. The question stayed. Your discomfort with the absence was the right response to something that was manufactured. I am not going to tell you what to believe about reincarnation. That is not what this is. This is about what was in the text, what was in the tradition, and what a politician decided should not be there anymore. John 9, verse 2. Still in your Bible. Still pointing at the removed answer. I'll let you sit with that.